oh, this is about a book. Yes, it is. And some of you have read the whole book. Some of you started the book but didn't finish. Some of you read the book twice. And some of you may have just found the Cliff Notes online. I want you to know that you're all in the right place, because no matter your knowledge of this book or not, this will be an interesting presentation, and we'll have a discussion afterwards about some of the issues that Joan brings up. Joan Sampieri is our presenter today. She'll pull together for us the many ways White House chiefs of staff have affected the presidents they served, from Ronald Reagan through Donald Trump's first year in office. At the end of her presentation, you'll each have the opportunity to discuss this topic with several other participants, then come back to the group and report some of your conversation. As we go along, please feel free to type in your questions in the chat box as Joan presents the material. By the way, if that chat box is distracting to you, as it is to me, you can minimize it so you only see Joan and her PowerPoint slides. So let me introduce my friend Joan Sampieri. Joan is presently the president of our local league's Ann Arbor chapter, and she's currently serving her second term. Joan joined the League of Women Voters in 2016 and was appointed to the board in 2017. Joan and I have run the Lunch and Learn series since the spring of 2016, and Joan has presented several of our programs. Some of the most recent were the history of voting rights in the United States and the world, and the background of the Equal Rights Amendment. Joan retired in December of 2019 from a business she owned that worked with not-for-profits. She's taught college-level classes in board development, grant writing, nonprofit finance, and fundraising. Joan has served on nonprofit boards since 1976. And in addition to her work with the League, she is the treasurer for a North American Quaker organization called the Friends General Conference. Joan is a mother of 4 grown children and shares a home in Bridgewater Township with her younger daughter, Jennifer Fairfield, who's also a League member. Joan is an avid genealogist, writer, and a voracious reader. We're happy to have you here, Joan, to discuss Chris Whipple's book, The Gatekeepers. So take it away, Joan.
Thank you very much, Dee. And good afternoon to everybody. Thanks for being here. I'm going to put some PowerPoint slides up so that you can follow along with me. I hope to have the right one up any moment now. We're going to do the slide presentation. This is not quite as easy as doing everything in person. I don't get to see your nods or anything else. And so it's interesting, but it's not as interesting for me because I don't get to see you. This is our one of our book club meetings at Lunch and Learn. And today we're going to be talking about The Gatekeepers, How the White House Chiefs of Staff Define Every Presidency by Chris Whipple. I had to read this book twice and then go back through it a third time. It's only 300 pages long, but it feels like it's about 9,000. I was pleased to be able to do it, but it really is a great deal of work. So I hope you'll stay with me as we wander our way through this. What I try to do, because Whipple packs this with so much information, I needed to find a format so that I could begin to compare what he was telling me about all of the chiefs. And so I'll take you through that, and I'll take you through the book, beginning with the Brown Law Commission. This was a very important commission formed in 1936 by FDR to look at administrative management in the government. This is a huge undertaking for a president and maybe eventually her administration. And Whipple says that the Brown Law report described the ideal qualities of a White House aide. So H.R. Haldeman, Harry Robbins Haldeman, talked about it shortly after he was appointed. The executive branch of the United States is the largest corporation in the world. It has the most awesome responsibilities of any corporation, the largest budget, and the largest number of employees. Yet the entire senior management structure and team have to be formed in a period of 75 days. What could possibly go wrong? I looked at this as a way of balancing my understanding of what the chiefs were trying to do, what they brought, what the presidents brought to the positions, what their policies, their politics, and their focus were. And Whipple's pretty good at really identifying a great number of those and talking about the things that got in the way or that made things easier. And then he and I both looked at external events that might have pushed things in a good direction or in a very bad direction. And you'll see some of what he says, because most of what I'm presenting to you comes directly from the book. There are a few things that I've added, but he really took a deep dive into all of this. And he starts with a conversation among about 17 people who had held the chief of staff position. They got together during the Obama administration, as the Obama administration was forming, to talk about what the chief of staff brought, what they saw, what they learned, and what they could pass on. And they made that very helpful. So Whipple starts with Dwight Eisenhower, and we're only going to give him the same amount of time that Whipple does, because it isn't really the start of the chiefs of staff, but it's the beginning of looking at how to manage differently. Eisenhower was an Army general. He wanted everything to be screened before he saw it, which I found a little strange. He once hollered at an aide because the aide brought him an envelope that was sealed and had left it sealed because it said personal and confidential. And he said, "I don't want anything that hasn't been opened." He was used to a chief of staff position in the Army, and he looked around for someone to manage his office the way that it had been done in the Army. And so he named someone he knew, former New Hampshire Governor Sherman Adams, as his gatekeeper. Now, Whipple doesn't go into any real detail about him, nor will we. John Kennedy preferred to act as his own chief of staff, and we'll look later at how that works for some of the other presidents. But again, Whipple doesn't go into a lot of detail with Kennedy. The Bay of Pigs invasion, which many of you will most likely remember or remember reading about, was a disaster for that administration. And so Kennedy realized that he needed somebody to filter what was coming to him. The Bay of Pigs happened in part because people came to him and presented ideas without discussing the political implications or the wider implications for the country. So he named his brother Bobby to fill the role as chief of staff, and he felt he could trust him. It wasn't quite the same relationship between Jack and Bobby that it was at Downton Abbey with the sisters, who were always trying to one-up one another. Good thing for Kennedy. Next came Lyndon Johnson, and he too is not looked at in depth because it was not a real chief of staff operation. Like Kennedy, he preferred to act as his own chief. He did everything. He had managed his office when he was in Congress. He read absolutely everything that crossed his desk. He set the policy priorities. And because he was used to working with Congress, he had a fairly comfortable relationship with them. He also managed his cabinet and staff. which proved to be somewhat, very unwieldy when it came to major issues. Whipple starts with Richard Nixon and H.R. Haldeman. Haldeman was an advertising executive. He began as a volunteer in the presidential race and then ran two failed races for Richard Nixon as governor of California. And finally, the winning 1968 campaign for president. Among their strengths and weaknesses, Haldeman was very organized. He put a staffing system in place. He thought that he should not, nor should the president, do the work, but rather delegate the work to the departments once the policies were clear. He cleared only 3 people to meet alone with Nixon because in the past with presidents, everybody had access and the president's ear. And so someone would come in at one point and say one thing from their perspective, but not in a meeting where people could thrash things out. Haldeman put a stop to that and cleared only 3 people. For Nixon, Whipple says that he was, for Haldeman, Whipple says that he was the very definition of a chief of staff as outlined in Brownlow. And we'll take a look at that definition a little bit later. Nixon and Haldeman, with their policies, their politics, and their focus, and remember, this is my lens for trying to funnel some of the massive amounts of information so that I could see them in a way that made sense to me. You may see them differently as you read the book, and again, I'm encouraging you to do that. It is jam-packed, and you will see Congress, the external events, the chief, and the president in ways that I don't think we've really looked at them before. Nixon and Haldeman faced an antagonistic Congress. Nixon managed, and with Haldeman's help, diplomatic relations well. One of his key policy initiatives, and then one of his best events while he was president, and something for which he is not often remembered, is that he opened up the doors to our relationship with China. It was a huge event and something that he did extremely well. I actually had an opportunity to hear him talk about that after he had resigned the presidency, and it was fascinating. He really understood the diplomatic relations. He also, and many of us didn't know this, established the Environmental Protection Agency, which I thought was quite interesting. The external events that caused him difficulty were inflation that was out of control, a postal workers' strike that Nixon called the military in to stand in for postal workers, Vietnam, and enormous protests. And Vietnam would prove to be a major part of Nixon's downfall. Haldeman, for all that he was a good chief of staff, was unable in some circumstances to tell Nixon no. And you'll see as we go through that's one of the crucial elements that a chief of staff brings to the table. And it can help to make or break what happens. Many of you may recall that there were some issues because Nixon felt that he was under siege, that the press didn't like him, that the protesters hated him, that the war in Vietnam was dragging him down as it did to Lyndon Johnson. And he decided to take some actions. One was that he proposed that they break into the Brookings Institution and try to cause some problems with Brookings. Haldeman did talk him out of most of that issue. The second time that there was a problem, you may recall that Daniel Ellsberg was a very outspoken person against the war in Vietnam. And so Nixon felt that it would be a good idea to break into Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office. That actually did happen and made headlines, but it didn't make headlines in quite the same way as the break-in at Watergate. Nixon and others did themselves in because it was suggested that he record things happening in the White House that he could use for his posterity, and when he wrote his book and when he had the presidential library. They found that he couldn't work the toggle on the first equipment that they put into the office, and so they put in a piece of equipment that was voice activated. And although we don't hear on that voice activation that he authorized the break-in of Watergate, we do hear that he and Haldeman were instrumental in a cover-up. And that became public knowledge and brought down his presidency. Haldeman had known, because he was being told that there were conversations about something like this. He was told a number of times, and yet he did not go to Nixon and demand that they find that something, whatever that was going on or was planned, was halted. And so it went forward, and a cover-up went forward, and it brought down that administration. H.R. Haldeman resigned in April of 1973 and was convicted of conspiracy and obstruction of justice. He served 18 months in prison. And then Richard Nixon resigned in August of 1974. He was the first president ever to have resigned. That brought in Gerald Ford and Alexander Haig. Ford was a member of Congress from our great state for 25 years. He became Nixon's VP in December of 1973 because Spiro Agnew, the vice president, was forced to resign. He'd had a couple of dealings that came to light and caused a scandal and caused his resignation. Ford's original chief of staff was Alexander Haig, and we'll see him traipsing his way through chiefs of staff or other things as we go along. From the start, people said that Ford's White House resembled a kid's soccer game with everybody running toward the ball. Haig was never a good fit. He wasn't good at managing things, and he was often frustrated because people ignored him. At one point, he told a story of how he saw somebody walking into the White House with a labeled inbox under his arm, walking in with things for the president to sign that should have gone through Haig. He didn't do well, he didn't serve well, and he didn't last long. Then came Donald Rumsfeld. Ford pardoned Richard Nixon, and I actually have a framed New York Times front page sitting in my office, on my office wall of that date. It's a little yellowed now, sort of like I'm becoming. Ford pardoned Nixon, and it had overwhelming repercussions. He had come in at reasonable poll numbers, and they tanked. Phone calls and other ways of communicating, either letters or in-person conversations, ran 8-1 against the pardon. And the press really hung him out to dry. He reached out to Donald Rumsfeld because Haig was not managing this issue. Rumsfeld was actually at his father's funeral when Ford called him. No, I'm sorry, that comes later. Rumsfeld was serving as an ambassador to the UN, and I think he was at The Hague, And that's when he got the call. The author, Whipple, says in a memo that Rumsfeld told Ford that governing without a chief is your quickest way to lose your credibility, because even though you're honest, the fact that you don't know what you're doing misleads people. Rumsfeld had been a 4-term congressman from Illinois, the head of Nixon's Office of Economic Opportunity and the Cost of Living Council. He was smart, he was politically savvy, he knew his way around DC. He was known for his organizational skills, and often they said about him, he made the trains run on time. He had one weakness that was evident from the beginning. He wanted to be president. He had initially looked at running earlier and had pulled out when there was not support. But he really wanted to be president. He delegated some of his work to Richard Cheney. And the author's very interesting about Cheney. It's a whole different person. He is a whole different person from the Dick Cheney we see later on in his work with presidents. But I thought I'd tell you that now. So with Ford and Rumsfeld, that was the memo. The president's perceived as direct and honest. They like you as an individual, but your morale's low. The administration doesn't function as a team. It's sloppy staff work, press leaks, and public disagreements, and people are running all over the place. So he says, your administration has to be seen as having sensible answers for the questions Americans are asking, that you're focusing on 3 to 5 big things. It shows purposefulness, and we're going to look at the economy, morality, freedom of choice, energy, whatever else, so that you're not all over the place. Those things have to be issues that are of interest to your constituency, and we have to make them our focus. 3 days after Haig resigned, Ford moved Rumsfeld, 3 days after that memo, I'm sorry, Ford moved Rumsfeld to the Pentagon, and Cheney became the chief of staff. Ford liked Cheney. Comes in, has his business to talk about, talks about it and goes out, and then goes and does it. I'm happy to work with him. So Cheney's temperament was different from Rumsfeld. He began to gain ground and settled into Ford began to gain ground and settle into the presidency. He was actually so well versed on the budget that he gave that year's press briefing on it, which no president had done before. Cheney had a somewhat checkered background coming into this position. He'd been not a really good student and had had a couple of drunk driving citations. Rumsfeld knew him, had met him, and had brought him on board. And when he was bringing him on as his aide, he went to the president and said, this is what's happening. This is what has happened in the past, but I trust him. And apparently so did everybody else. He no longer drank, and he settled in and apparently was quite good at making things work. Unfortunately, things didn't work for Ford and Rumsfeld. External events, as with every president, got in the way of some of the best laid plans. I can't imagine you get up in the morning and you say, I want to focus on the economy, I'm going to do this. Yeah, we get thrown off when the electricity goes out in a storm. But here's the White House, and they're trying to get some things done. And suddenly somebody is coming to them saying, we think that we're going to lose Saigon, and the American people who are still there. There had been a withdrawal from Saigon in 1973 with the Paris Peace Agreement, the Paris Peace Accord, but we still had Americans in there, civilians, and also some Vietnamese who had worked with us who needed to be evacuated. There were some issues about whether Saigon was really going to fall. There were some people who felt that if we threw a little money, a lot of money at it, that we could stabilize the government. But April 30th, 1975, Saigon fell, and it was televised. We evacuated people, but toward the end, there were some of our administrators left standing on a roof, and there were photographs of that showed up in the press. That was devastating to Ford and to Rumsfeld. In June, Ronald Reagan announced that he would challenge Ford for the Republican nomination. Inflation was at 12%, employment was at 9%, which was high for those days, and then there was the swine flu. So trying to work with Congress and explain what happened with Saigon and why inflation was still so high, and yet focus on some of the larger pictures in the external world must have been so challenging. Ford lost the election, and in came Jimmy Carter and Hamilton, and you'll recognize if you've been around long enough, it is not Jordan, it's Jordan. His name was always pronounced Hamilton Jordan. Carter had been a successful businessman, a one-term successful governor of Georgia, and generally considered very intelligent. Jordan ran Carter's successful 70 campaign, served as his executive secretary, his successful 70 gubernatorial campaign, served as Carter's executive secretary, and was considered a brilliant political strategist. Oh, but he was very laid back. Carter was a micromanager, and you'll hear spokes of the wheel. Most of the successful chiefs of staff in that gathering in Obama's transition office talked about how spokes of the wheel didn't work. It meant that the president was in charge and everybody reported to him. And Carter did that and read everything that came across his desk. He was known to send things back to people with spelling corrections. When they sent him a memo, he read it so carefully. Jordan came in with a real commitment to Carter, but he lacked polish. He was more of an idea person and a true believer than somebody who could take the idea and funnel it down into action. He hated administrative duties. He didn't like being in his office, and he wouldn't return calls from members of Congress. He was terrible at that. And they needed congressional attachments because Carter was an outsider. Carter had no real congressional attachments, and neither of them was very good at, well, Jordan wasn't very good at all, but Carter wasn't real good at working with Congress. They did, however, pass the Panama Canal Treaty, giving the canal back to the people of Panama. But they faced congressional opposition to cuts to domestic water projects. It was one of the first things that they tackled, and Congress came with something like 300 proposal to build or reconstruct 300 dams, and Carter said, no, this is pork barrel. And so he cut it down to only, to under 30. It passed with most of those projects back in it. It was their first real loss. They did manage to deregulate natural gas. And they proposed a national energy policy. In the 4 years that Carter was president, his administration did manage to get a number of things done. But they too faced external events. OPEC increased the price of oil, and there were long lines and bitter arguments, and constituents were very unhappy and were very vocally unhappy. One of his cabinet members, Bert Lance, was caught in a scandal from prior to being the cabinet member. Iran came in and captured 66 of our civilian members in the embassy and held them hostage. Ted Kennedy announced that he'd run for presidency against Carter. And then there was Operation Eagle Claw, which was a wildly failed attempt to rescue the hostages. And Ronald Reagan announced that he'd run for the Republican nomination. Not a good time. Hamilton Jordan resigned in June of 1980 to run Carter's re-election campaign, and Jack Watson became the chief of staff. Watson was originally passed over for the chief's position, but he had managed several important crises during Jordan's tenure while he served as assistant. 3 Mile Island happened, and Watson did a good job of managing it. There were also hurricanes. It was Hurricane Hugo, and he apparently really understood how to take the crisis, make sure that Carter and his people spoke to their constituents, and helped to make things work so that these things so that the issues got dealt with. Presidential Quarterly in 1993 said that Watson was one of the 3 best chiefs in modern history, but he had a short tenure and a whole lot of crises to deal with. We shouldn't think that putting one person, this is what Watson says, we shouldn't think that putting one person in a position changes everything. It wouldn't have eliminated inflation, made the hostage situation go away, but it would have created an initial impression of more organization, of a clearer sense of priorities, and of a more professional operation. And in came Ronald Reagan. Reagan had been an actor, a union leader, a 2-term governor of California. He brought a lot of governing experience with him to his role as president. Baker was a former Marine, a Texas lawyer, a close friend of George W. Bush, as a matter of fact, Herbert Walker Bush. And as a matter of fact, he'd been involved heavily in the Bush presidential campaign when Bush lost to Reagan in the primary. He knew his way around Washington. He was known as a pragmatist and a strong negotiator. Baker formed a legislative policy group that made sure that they took a good long look at everything, and then worked with Congress to make sure that what they wanted, what their policy choices and hopes were, really had a chance of passing. Baker made a study of the first 100 days of the 5 previous presidents and made sure, because when he looked at it, he saw that the one thing that wasn't happening in most of those administrations was that the focus wasn't there, that they hadn't carved out the things that were important, the most important, and ranked them and stuck with those rather than going all over the place. Baker said there were 3 goals, and all 3 were the economy. They proposed a constitutional amendment to allow prayer in schools. It didn't pass. They enacted the largest tax cuts in US history. But Congress passed, and Reagan was forced to sign an increase every year from 1981 to 1987, simply because there was such a deficit. The Reagan administration ordered a buildup of the military during the Reagan and Baker tenure. But again, external events kept some of the focus and some of the policies that they'd hoped for from happening. The Soviets marched into Afghanistan. Reagan was shot on March 30th of 1981. And again, here comes Alexander Haig. Haig is serving in the cabinet, and when the crisis occurred and Reagan was taken to the hospital and they didn't know what was happening with him, Baker went to the hospital. In the meantime, the rest of the cabinet, or many of them, went to a place where they could talk, and were trying to decide how to approach it, what to tell the American people. Oh, and Alexander Haig came running into the room. He heard them trying to make decisions and saw that the press were beginning to form in the press office, and that there was some confusion about what the press statement was going to be and how Reagan was. So Haig went running in and said, "Gentlemen," because probably at that point, either all the reporters were gentlemen or he didn't recognize that there were women in the room. "Gentlemen, I'm here to tell you," something like that, "I am now in charge because the Constitution says it's the vice president, the president, and then me," and I'm forgetting what his cabinet position was. I think Secretary of State. He was a little wrong. It's the president, the vice president, and the Speaker of the House. Interest rates were at 20% as all of this is happening. Baker resigns in early 1985 to become Secretary of the Treasury and is replaced by Ronald Reagan. Whoop. Reagan was the former chairman of Merrill Lynch, Treasury Secretary, but he had a large ego. He said, "A sparrow won't land on the White House lawn without my knowing about it." It didn't exactly happen that way. During his tenure, there was immigration reform, the Immigration Reform and Control Act, the war on drugs with mandatory minimum sentencing. Apartheid, and what the United States was going to do about it, if anything. And then came the Iran-Contra issue. It seems that we were selling arms to Iran. We were selling arms to Israel. Israel was selling them to Iran with our knowledge. But during some of this, the Israelis bought some of our arms and then sold them to a Nicaragua Contra group under Oliver North. It made headlines. It made for a catastrophe. It made for embarrassment. Initially, Reagan said that he knew nothing about it. And then after there was a commission to look at it, he said, "Well, I was wrong. I did." And on top of that was the Bitburg incident. Reagan was invited to visit graves in Germany. And it was snowing. There had been an advance team out to look at it. Everything looked okay. The problem was that the grave sites were of Nazis and Nazi sympathizers, not of people who had been damaged by the Nazis. And it too caused a furor. It was a disaster, both politically and in the press. They lost a lot of points in the polls. And then in January 1987, Don Regan hung up on the First Lady, something one should never do. By February, he was out, and he never spoke to Reagan again. In came Howard Baker. He was a former Senate Majority Leader, Vice Chair of the Senate Watergate Committee, a political animal, just exactly what Reagan needed to help him get the rest of his policies and his positions through Congress. But he needed, Baker needed help from his assistant, Ken Duberstein, when his wife was diagnosed with cancer. Reagan makes a televised address in March 1987, admitting the truth about Iran-Contra. He focuses on international politics during the Brandenburg Gate that was opposed by many of his cabinet members, in which he said, "Open up the gate to the Soviet Union." That was met with a great deal of applause. It then came George H.W. Bush and John Sununu. Bush was a Yale graduate, headed several oil companies, served in Congress, and was Reagan's VP. But he was seen by a lot of people as Reagan's toady, and they called him that openly. Sununu was the pugnacious governor of Rhode Island, sharp-tongued, and although former chiefs went to him and suggested what he might want to do as he ran the office, he didn't listen. Bush came in saying, "Read my lips, no new taxes." But he was successful in getting a reduction. He wasn't successful in staying with no new taxes. He did pass a tax reform bill that lowered taxes, but he was forced to raise them again. Congress forced him to because of deficits. He was successful in a reduction in nuclear weapons. He and Sununu focused on dismantling the communist bloc, which was one of Bush's real desires. He strengthened the Clear Air Act, and he passed the Americans with Disabilities Act. In November of 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. But then in 1990, Iraqi troops were poised to enter Kuwait. And there was concern about the oil fields in Afghanistan. We entered into Operation Desert Storm in Afghanistan, which has proved to be the longest war in American history. And a recession began. Sununu caused a scandal, using military planes, helicopters, White House limos for personal trips. It broke in the press. He ended up hollering publicly at a White House journalist that he was a liar about Sununu's use of the helicopters and limos. He used a limo one time to go to a stamp collectors meeting in New York from Washington. And that's what the Washington Post apparently broke. In December of 1991, he resigned. In came Samuel Skinner. He'd been the Secretary of Transportation, a businessman and a bureaucrat, called the Master of Disaster for handling several major crises. He was not there long enough for much of a political and policy advance because external events began to enter in again. It was the end of the Soviet Union. Mikhail Gorbachev actually called George Bush on Christmas to tell him that there was no longer a Soviet Union, that it had fallen. I was in the Soviet Union in September 1991, and I could still smell burning piles of trash and bonfires that protesters had set. And what ended was that the end of the Soviet Union. But Pat Buchanan announced a primary campaign against Bush. Ross Perot started a third-party campaign, and Bill Clinton decided to run for president. George Bush lost. Well, he lost after he brought James Baker in Baker became the chief of staff in August 1992 to see if he could turn things around. And they did begin to turn things around. One of their policies was NAFTA, and it was successfully passed, it successfully approved in Congress. Bush signed it, but unfortunately for Bush, it did not go into effect until Clinton came in, and Bush lost. William Jefferson Clinton and Thomas McLarty came in next. Clinton had boundless energy, great charm, and bold initiatives, according to Whipple, according to an Arkansas AG, and he'll become too unfocused and too eager to please. McLarty was charming, courtly, made a fortune for Ford Trucking, and was the head of Arkansas, Louisiana, and gas, but he lacked Washington experience. They focused early on almost nothing. Anyone and everyone could talk to the press. There were people making statements to the press about policy issues, and then someone would come behind them and make a different issue. They did get a deficit reduction plan passed. Clinton signed the Brady bill, because as you may recall, Mr. Brady was with Ronald Reagan when he was shot, and he was shot and permanently disabled. The Brady bill limited access to guns, had much more to say about gun control, and it was signed by Clinton. There were not middle-class tax cuts or a stimulus package or health care. Initially, when Clinton entered, he looked at having Hillary put together a health care package that was done without Congress, which is never a good idea. With the best of intentions for the American people, they looked at ways in which to insure all of us, but Congress worked against them and made sure that it would fail. It was not ripe because it was not at that point something where everyone worked together. And that never works. Congress will always stand in your way if it's an opposition party, or even if it's your own, if you don't work with them. External events. Clinton came in saying that he would allow gays in the military, but he backed down. And his final policy was don't ask, don't tell, which angered everybody because it was a halfway measure that allowed gays in, but they couldn't talk about it, and nobody else was supposed to tell. And it angered those who were opposed to gays in the military because it allowed them. A second scandal was a travel office firing. It was a wholesale firing of the travel office, and it wasn't managed well. It became headlines, and headlines that went on forever. Vince Foster, a close friend of theirs and a member of their administration, of the Clinton administration, committed suicide. And there were all kinds of conspiracy theories and issues. And then Whitewater happened, and that was an issue of how the Clintons had managed some investments and some sales. Again, blowing up in the press and in constituents' minds, whether people were Democrats or Republicans. That always gets in your way. Clinton brought in Leon Panetta. Panetta became chief of staff in June of 1991. He'd been an Army intelligence officer, head of health, education, and welfare under Nixon, a 9-term congressman, a director of the OMB. He was respected and good-natured. He had a lot of what a chief of staff needs to have. He had congressional liaison experience because he'd been a congressman. He'd been a staffer, and he was someone who had managed a large office, and so probably could be a good chief of staff. By 1994, the hope for our health care package was dead. In 1995, and a month-long government shutdown ensued. Clinton would not back down from some of the budget proposals because, oops, my internet just froze. You may have seen an interruption. Clinton would not back down from the budget because Congress wanted too many cuts to programs that were safety nets. In the end, the Republicans took the hit for the government shutdown, and the budget passed. Whoops. External events with Panetta. Republican landslide in Congress in '94, the first Republican majority in 40 years. Newt Gingrich proposed a contract with America that was very conservative. The Oklahoma bombing occurred, in which Timothy McVeigh went into a federal office building in Oklahoma and killed with a bomb too many people. And farther externally, there was ethnic cleansing in Serbia that the Clinton administration needed to deal with. Clinton replaced Panetta with Erskine Bowles. He was an entrepreneur and an investment banker, served as Panetta's assistant, and expected to be treated as an adult. He looked at Clinton's inefficiencies in time use and the inefficiencies of the whole office in using Clinton's time. He went in and managed things differently. Bowles carried a card with priorities. And every time Clinton came out of his office and said, "I have an idea for," Bowles would say to him, "Pull the card out. What is your priority? Go back in there and look at it." Which apparently no one had said to Clinton very easily. And the balanced budget was number one. The Clinton administration was successful in passing that. And they also passed, while Bowles was chief of staff, the state children's health insurance plan that covered thousands and thousands of children who had not been previously insured. And then we came to the affair. I would not exactly call it that, with Monica Lewinsky. That created one of the largest scandals in our history. It was stupid. And it occurs to me to ask the question that maybe you might want to talk about in your groups. How did that get past the chief of staff? How did Monica Lewinsky get into the Oval Office and have an affair with Bill Clinton if everything was being managed? There were rumors about it, but nothing happened until it broke. Osama bin Laden we were told, had chemical weapons. And then the Republicans lost the midterms and Gingrich resigned as speaker. But there was an impeachment in Bill Clinton's future, and Congress impeached him. The Senate did not. The Senate did not find him guilty. Podesta began in October of 1998. He was wiry, profane, ascetic, a relentless environmentalist, and he had worked on Capitol Hill. He brought with him some of the ability to work with Congress. Bowles resigned and Clinton handed it to John Podesta because Bowles could not work with Clinton after the Lewinsky affair. He was so disheartened by that he left. Under Clinton and Podesta, there were smaller initiatives. Clinton used more executive orders, and in the end, the very last day of his presidency, he issued last-minute pardons that caused a huge scandal. They saw issues in the Balkans and issues within their own community. Al Gore announced that he was running for president, and Hillary Rodham Clinton decided to run for the Senate. There are all kinds of things going on just at the very end. In came George W. Bush and Andrew Card. Bush founded an oil exploration company and was one of the owners of the Texas Rangers and then governor of Texas. When Bush sold his position in the Texas Rangers, he made $15 million. Card was a deputy chief under 41 and Secretary of Transportation. He was considered earnest, wide-eyed, enthusiastic, organized, and efficient. During Card's term, the administration expanded the reach of NASA, the National Security Administration. I think that's the National Security Administration, and agreed to enhanced interrogations, like waterboarding. They rejected the cap on carbon emissions and the Kyoto Accord. Among external events was September 11th. A horrible time. Bush did not look good in the press because when Andrew Card told him about the issue, told him that a second plane had hit the towers, he sat without moving for a long period of time. We invaded Iraq in 2002 after going to the United Nations and having Colin Powell say that there was evidence of weapons of mass destruction. Katrina came, and it was a mess. It was handled poorly from the beginning. It became a scandal that rocked, again, the Bush administration. And then there was the scandal of Abu Ghraib and waterboarding. We invaded Afghanistan, routed the Taliban, and the author says decimated al-Qaeda. Card resigns in March of 2006, and in comes Joshua Bolten, not to be confused with John Bolton. Bolton had been the OMB director, was the son of a CIA officer, and had brought with him a great deal of government experience. During Bolton's term, there was a Taliban insurgency that led to increased troops, even though we had backed off some troops after the successful rout of al-Qaeda, and a worldwide financial crisis. In comes Barack Obama and his first chief of staff, Rahm Emanuel. Obama was educated. He'd worked as a community organizer. He'd served in the Illinois legislature and been a member of Congress. So he brought governing experience and congressional experience with him. Emanuel was combative, hard-charging, a member of Congress, and said once in the press's hearing, "You never want a crisis to go to waste." They got a lot done when Emanuel was chief of staff. There were executive orders and memoranda in the first 100 days. They ordered the closing of Guantanamo Bay, but Congress refused to appropriate the funds. The Fair Pay Act passed. 2 women to the Supreme Court were appointed to the Supreme Court. LGBT rights, without the Q yet, were approved. The economy recovered. We had an enormous surplus for the first time. The Affordable Care Act passed in March of 2010, and we began Iraq nuclear talks. There was a combat mission among the external events during Emanuel's term that ended in 2010 successfully. The war in Afghanistan continued and would prove to be the longest war in our history. Emanuel resigned in order to run for mayor of Chicago, something he'd always wanted to do, and he won. William Daley, and I put Richard Daley, look at that. that was the mayor of Chicago. William Daley's term began in January 2011 and ended in January 2012. He faced the Tea Party Republicans in Congress, and during his tenure, Osama bin Laden was killed by US forces. He did not last long enough even for me to get his name right. Jacob Lew came in next with Obama. He began on January 9th, 2012 and served until December of that year. During his tenure, the Supreme Court ruled on the Affordable Care Act, approving it. A gunman opened fire in a movie theater in Colorado, and a young man was killed, 20 first graders and 6 staff at Sandy Hook Elementary. I would not have wanted to be Jacob Lew or Barack Obama. In came Dennis McDonough, a graduate of St. John's University of Minnesota and Georgetown, the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service. He was a policy advisor to Obama, wiry, intense, and workaholic. External events. We began talking to Cuba to end our embargoes and our ability for people to enter Cuba. The Russians invaded Crimea. The Israeli settlements created a furor. The US voted against condemning the settlements at the UN. We were the only one of the top nations to do that. In came Donald Trump and Reince Priebus. Trump was an entrepreneur, a businessman, a reality TV star, and a hands-on manager. Priebus was an attorney, the chairman of the Wisconsin Republican Party, the RNC chairman, but he barely knew his own new boss. And someone said about him, he approached the job like it was some combination of personal aide and cruise director, and he responded to the fire of the day. There were a lot of policies and politics in this during Priebus's term as chief of staff. Immigration reform began, tax reform passed. There was a rejection of climate change, and there was an executive order that for every new regulation, 2 existing regulations had to be identified for elimination. The administration pushed for elimination of the Affordable Care Act and began the separation of migrant children from families. John Kelly came in as, after Reince Priebus. He replaced Priebus, who lasted only until July. Kelly was a 4-star Marine general, Secretary of Homeland Security under Trump. He removed Anthony Scaramucci as communications director on his very first day of service as chief of staff. He is said to be disciplined, and he said that the office felt like Grand Central Station when he came in. He vetted anyone who wanted access, including Ivanka Trump and Jared Kushner. During Kelly's tenure, the Charlottesville, Virginia protests resulted in violence and a comment by the president that caused a press issue and an issue with constituents. Later, there were problems with phone calls to Gold Star families. Kelly lost his temper with a Florida legislator who was a friend of one of the families, and he refused to apologize. Kelly, and that's as far as this book goes. Every president is destined to fail in some way, because the job involves a wider range of talents than any person has. And so, yes, every president should have a chief of staff who makes a complete whole, and very few do. That was said by Jimmy Carter's speech writer, James Fallows. Oh, I'm running out of steam here. James Fallows. And that is the end of my presentation. I hope you've learned a bit and have been interested to read all the things I had to leave out so that you could, at some point, not spend 6 hours on this lunch and learn. Thank you very much, Dee, and the rest of you.
Thanks, Joan. Wow, I read the whole book and I feel like I missed a lot. So thank you for filling in those gaps. And thanks to all of you who have stayed through this presentation, which I personally really appreciate. Anyway, we're going to have a small group discussion at this time, and hopefully you can stay with us. You're going to be put into a random group of several people. And then when Shelley is ready to put you into a group, you'll get a little mention on the screen. It'll say, will you join this group? And just click on that. You'll have 10 minutes to chat. You will get a 60-second warning. That means finish up what you're saying and say goodbye to folks, and then you can come back to the group. If you carry on for longer than 60 seconds, you'll be back anyway, and we will welcome you. Also, choose somebody to report for your group, because we will have a short report from each of the groups about something especially interesting, a question, or whatever has come up. You can talk about any questions you have, surprises, thoughts, about any of the successful or unsuccessful chiefs of staff. Some questions that Joan suggested that you might talk about is, there have been no women chiefs of staff. What women leaders can you suggest that who would make a good chief of staff? And we do not want you to join a breakout room right now, because I haven't finished with the questions. So the chief of staff is all that Brown law suggests. How did the Monica Lewinsky scandal ever happen? And how did Watergate get so out of control that it cost Richard Nixon the presidency? Okay, it's time to join your group, and we'll see you later. And we really like feedback about that. Was it worth it? Was it not? Whatever. Then there are going to be details coming out about the July Lunch and Learn. That isn't all set yet, but it will be, so stay tuned. Donna Crutter has set up a number of wonderful forums for candidates, so check the website lwvannarbor.org for those. And I wanted to say thanks to our tech team, Shelley Shanfield, Mary Ellen Hagenauer, and Susan Woolley, who helped out even though she wasn't here today. So I just want to say to all of you, stay well, stay safe, and we'll see you next month for Lunch and Learn. Bye-bye.